can we go together, right? Because that's that next layer. We found something on our own. What happens when we bring it into community? What happens when we do it together? And that's has been and continues to be this question that I am so inspired to explore and drop deeper and deeper and deeper and become more and more a being that actually sees and witnesses the sacred as a felt experience.
We are learning to trust the ever-evolving rhythms of nature.
We are committed to embracing our shadow within community
and reclaiming our sovereignty.
We do this together.
That is the way.
Welcome to the Elemental Movement Podcast. I'm Dr. Matt Matucci, and this is my dear brother, Elden Vala. And today we're going to be talking about warriorship and the archetype of the warrior. This conversation became one that interested us in various conversations we've had about this idea of warriorship and being a warrior and being the sacred masculine warrior and what that means. And I guess where I wanted to start with this conversation, Eldon, is about what does the sacred masculine warrior mean to you?
It's a big ass question, man.
Yeah, it's basically the podcast right there in a nutshell. We're just going to dive right in.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first place it brings me is to memories of where I wasn't embodying that archetype, which feels like for me, like it feels like where I need to start. There have been moments as a father where I have not held clean, clear boundaries with my child, and have then had larger than necessary expressions of anger when my boundaries that weren't clean or clear were violated. Anger for me in this context looks like raising my voice unnecessarily in terms of her.
Yeah.
Another place that I can see where I haven't upheld this archetype is in relationships with other men, where I have basically suppressed my own voice to avoid rattling the cage, if you will, to avoid like creating discomfort with these conversations where I could feel a misalignment in our connection and didn't speak up for it.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from you is very interesting, and I really love it because there's a common thread, and it's like different points of that common thread are opposites, in that you have in one situation you didn't voice a boundary and then you got too big with your daughter, right? And then in another situation you didn't voice a boundary was crossed again, but you just got small. And so it's what I'm hearing is there is a balance present in true warriorship, in the sacred masculine warriors. There's a balanced but strong and firm boundary that is created.
Yeah, I feel that for me, the way that I experience myself when I am embodying this archetype is that I'm very aware of my shape and my size. And I use those words shape and size in a very broad sense. It's like, yes, my physical shape and my physical size, my physical weight, my gravity, but also my emotional and energetic like shape.
How you fill in the space.
And I think my biggest litmus test, the reason I brought my child in first and was about to get to my partner Isla, that is my child and my woman, my partner. They, more than anybody else, show me viscerally if I'm embodying this archetype or not. Yeah. Because when I am, they feel safe with me. They feel open with me. There is like capacity for emotional expression in a very honest and forthright way, whether that's joy or sadness or whatever. When I'm not, there is an energetic shutdown, withdrawal, etc. Essentially, like I'm not holding a safe space in that way. You know, before we got on the phone or got on the call here, we were talking about what was alive around this topic. And what I brought up was like honesty. And that at the core of this principle of warriorship feels like an upholding of honesty.
Let that one just sink in for a moment there. I couldn't agree more. And where I see that honesty has to come through. Like, it's easy to be honest when it's easy to be honest, right? There are times where it's super easy, right? You're just like, things are good and like things are in flow and we can just be honest here. That's easy. But when there's disagreement between people, misalignment of values, ways that people are operating that are out of alignment with the way that you want to operate. You reference that in relation to other men that you spend time with. And it's like they do something, they say something, whatever is done. It's like, that does not sit right with me. I need to speak up. Maybe you don't, you get small. I remember one instance where language was used in a text thread that we were a part of for a basketball group. Right?
Yeah.
And in that, you were not down with that language. And I think a lot of us weren't, but we're just like, he's just being like a high school kid. He's 30, but he's, being a child. And we're just going to that's just how he is. And we'll just let it go. He didn't mean anything by it. And you're like, nah, that's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a fine line, because I remember kind of calling you out in a way at one point with it, because you called out that energy, but you did it in such a way that there was also this energy of like, you wanted him to you mic dropped and you wanted him to feel the sting a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I was like, hey man, the way you did that kind of made it a little messy for the entire group. And you were like, yeah, you're right. And so it's like, there is another layer of honesty, right? It's like, it's being honest with yourself when you behave in a way that is not embodying that right action. I'll bring it to an example myself, so I don't just put you on the spot. Of a couple days ago, I was reading a book to my children for bedtime, and my wife had our daughter on her lap, my 2-year-old daughter, and I was laying down, and my wife dropped our daughter, and my daughter headbutted me right in the face and hit me so hard, and I lost it. I was like, what the fuck just happened? Because I didn't even see what happened, because I was reading a book without even seeing. And my wife she told me to get out, and I had to settle myself and work through that anger and that what happened, that trying to blame someone for something. And ultimately I had to apologize, and I had to work with challenge I put into the space that I got way too big for that moment and became a threat to to the space. I had to own that, and I had to deal with some of the fallout of that, of the coming day or two, where my son was like, I don't want you to put me to sleep tonight. And I'm like, why? And he wouldn't tell me why. But I was like, oh, it's probably because last night I got too big. I messed up. And so I had to repair through making my energy safe again and being honest with myself of oh, that's not the right way to show up. That was not okay if I'm trying to embody that thing.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of the things that you just brought in, and just while you were telling that story, I was having my own memories of my own story of a very similar energy that happened last week. So it was just same, but different. There's two threads that are presenting themselves here to me that I want to pull on at the same time. One is that the energy that I'm feeling around warriorship is a collective energy, not opposed to an individual. It's we have our individual work to do with this, but it's actually to me, the warrior is existing as part of a collective, needs to be part of that collective in order to actually to balance themselves. I think we need our checks and balances, if you will, and accountability. So that's one piece.
Ooh, can I speak to that? Can you hold your
Yeah.
other piece for a moment?
I don't know if I can or not, but don't worry about it. Go.
But I just love what you just said, because I feel that so much with my fellow brothers, right? My fellow warriors that I spend my time with, that I communicate with, like yourself. When I'm in connection and relation with people who are also striving to embody that same archetype, I show up better for my family. I show up better for the world around me. And if I'm then isolated and left to my own devices, left to my own crazy, shit gets fucked pretty quickly. Like, not super quickly, but a few days, a week, the mistakes start to mount up. The falling off the track happens. But the more I'm around those other people walking through that same path, or striving to walk on that same path, it's much easier to adhere to it. And there is this building of that energy, of that way of being.
Yeah, I mean, so the other piece that it feels like it's very interconnected here, that I was going to bring in is, so we'd already brought in this idea of honesty, and like in the story that you shared both about me in that text thread, when I called out homophobic language use in a particular type of way, and then just vanished, and then also when you got headbutted. In both of those situations, like, we were honest, but the way that we expressed our honesty had baggage that didn't actually serve the rest of what was there.
Yes.
Right. So for me, like in that text thread, calling out the language that was being used, I called it out from a place of like, hey, like, I'm not going to accept this. And the way that I called it out was an immature way that was essentially working to elicit a fight response.
Exactly.
And
it wasn't eliciting healing. The chance for healing.
it was used as a disruptive tool, which, there's a place for that. And if I want to be in full integrity with my own intent, which is to hold myself and everyone else around me to a higher level of integrity, there's a different way to go about doing that.
Yeah.
Because that energy actually just creates repulsion. And then, like, essentially we're putting our fists up and like getting ready to duke it out, whether that's metaphorical, physical.
Yes.
And like, there's a part of me that loves that. Like, I want that.
Yeah.
Right. But that part is, in that context, is coming from a place of, it wasn't inviting it in as a, like, let's learn this together, right? Where it's like, hey, yo, like, I actually want to, like, I want to battle with you right now. Like, will you battle with me? And waiting for that consent.
Yeah.
It was essentially like throwing up the first blow and then walking away.
Mic drop.
Right.
I love that. Yeah. And so it really is this honesty with other people as well as yourself. Right. And it's almost more important, the honesty with yourself, at least to start. Because that's a tricky one.
Yeah. So what you said, like, I agree. And I don't feel like I can actually separate the two, because I might feel like I was just honest and righteous in a particular moment. Like in this expression, I'm like, homeboys using homophobic language, I know how dangerous that is from like personal experience. Like, no. And so that was honest, and I'm honest with myself. Like, I actually feel good about this. Weeks later or a month later, you come to me, you're like, hey man, like, you remember when you did that thing? Like, you actually could have done that better. And from that vantage point, I'm like, oh shit, like, you're actually 100% correct. Like, I could have done that better. There was a more mature, more benevolent way that I could have gone about using the same energy that I articulated with honesty that I wouldn't have access to without a reflection, because that's my shadow. And I can't see my own shadow without help.
Yeah, which brings in that piece. It's like you need others. We can't do it on our own.
Yeah.
You know, I think that brings it back to this piece about that sacred masculine warrior is that person, that archetype. It's the one that it's not trying to fight. The person that you were when you were defending, like you're like going against that language, but you're putting up a fight. Like that's not what we are looking for, or that's not what we're trying to embody. Right? That's not the archetype that we're discussing right now.
That archetype, that energetic like expression of that archetype perpetuates divisiveness and division.
Yes.
And like all you got to do is look around anywhere right now and you can see that. And it's literally ripping us apart and has been for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yes. And so that warriorship is something a little further, a little more mature. We could using your language, one that we're stepping a little deeper into that place of solid ground. That's like there's reflection, there's communication, there's connection between others. And when we sit with our actions in that, it's like it just feels good. It's like, I'm operating in a way that's bringing about healing and connection rather than like splitting things up, causing issues, causing disconnection.
Yeah. I mean, there was a word that came up as you were speaking, humility. To me, humility feels like a core energetic tenet of true warriorship. And I love, so I'm going to use a definition of humility that I got from Bridge Feltis, one of my teachers, which I absolutely love. And it's a Buddhist view that to be humble is to be fully oneself and to notice when we are comparing ourselves to anyone else as better than, less than, or same as. And that anytime we're doing that, we're actually lacking humility. So if I put myself down lower than is my place, I'm not being humble. If I make myself the same as, I'm also not being humble. And if I make myself like bigger than, better than, whatever, I'm not being humble. So coming back to that energetic shape and size, it's like really owning myself.
And so that brings me to this idea of like this archetype that we embody, that we're seeking to embody, this state of humility. Like these are states. It's not like you're going to be there all the time. And when you're not there, to have the grace with yourself to be like, yeah, I wasn't there. It's okay. I'm not perfect. I'm human. And to give yourself the permission to actually look like, oh, I wasn't there. To like have the awareness and the acceptance that I wasn't there. And then to enter back into that state as gracefully and as easily as possible.
Yeah. And that brings me to what is our thermostat? Like, how do we know? And I'd love to bring this to life in a very practical sense for each of us. So Matt, do you know how you know when you're out of alignment with that?
It can be tough, man. I'm being honest. You had spoken to your closest people being really good barometers for you. That's a good one for me too. They are often the people that can take me out of that alignment and out of that archetype as quickly as anyone else can, or quicker. Especially right now, my young son, he's just brimming with energy, and he will just get into these states where he wants to cause just chaos and destruction, and he'll harm his sister, he'll harm the dog, he'll harm his mom, but he's doing it in this maniacal, like overjoyed way. And that's a tough energy for me to not just want to stamp out. And so it's like, how do you channel it in a way that doesn't push it down? And that's where I know I need to be. And so he's been a really good teacher for me in that. And even just yesterday, he like knocked over this vacuum cleaner that was in the pantry, and I, barked at him, and he was like, "You just yelled at me." And I'm like, "No, I didn't yell at you." He's like, "You did yell at me." My little 3.5-year-old son calling me out. And my wife comes in and she's like, "I did hear you raise your voice." And I was like, I turned to him, like, "I guess I yelled at you. I'm sorry, man." And so like, again, it's like reflector. I need people to reflect it to me, because in that moment, I didn't think I yelled, but I guess I did. And to have the humility to actually listen to those around me and not be like, "No, I didn't yell. You know what you're talking about." It's like, no, I guess I did. Shoot. My bad. Take a breath. Let me bring you in close once you're willing to receive it and apologize for my actions. And then come from a different place. Let's work with that. And then, then I was playing with him and being a monster, and he's having a great time with his dad again. It's like, okay, now I'm holding the container in a way that's channeling that energy. So yeah, I guess it comes back to that for me. It's like a lot of times I need those reflectors. Now, the problem is that sometimes the reflectors we have, those reflections that are provided for us, aren't good reflections. Like sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Depends on the people we have around us. So that's where it can get a bit dicey.
Yeah. You got to have good people around you. You got to have the right people around you. So I want to expand for myself. One of the ways that I have noticed that the imbalanced expression of this coming up is energetically in my system. I feel my energy going up very strongly. I mean, for anybody that's familiar with like the nervous system's language, the sympathetic activation in a big way.
Yeah.
And for me, that manifests as, again, upwards energy. I get posturally a little bit bigger. My voice gets a little bit harder. My eyes get a little bit harder. I become less aware of my gut and more aware of a racing around my head. Like,
yeah,
could be thoughts, but I actually want to expand beyond thoughts. It's just like there's a lot happening up. It's a lot of up energy.
Well,
And
which is really just, that is anger. You are describing the energetic signature of anger as an emotion and how that manifests energetically. It's upward energy.
And so with this, there's nothing wrong with that energy.
Yeah.
Right? That energy, there's a lot right with it. And I got to know how to use it skillfully.
And that's like the warning light to harken back to our brother Alika and his green light, yellow light, red light. I love that simple little model. It's like you're in yellow light right there. And maybe in that, moving into red.
Yeah. Well, in that yellow light phase, it doesn't take much to get me to red. Right. And I'll bring a real life example into this. There was an interaction happening last week with my daughter where she was melting down. It was time to like take a shower, and like I had done a bad job of setting clean, clear boundaries. She's having an emotional response to it. And I'm like, that energy's coming up. And then my partner Isla is coming down the stairs and drops a brush. And the brush clatters down the stairs. I'm already in this elevated state. When that clattering happened, I yelled at Isla.
Yeah.
Like, why are you throwing the brush? And she's like, bro, like, you need to chill. Like, I don't remember exactly what she said, but the energy was like, do not come at me with that. I had dropped a brush, like, you need to chill. And I'm like,
Step back.
shit. Like, I do need to chill. Like, that is totally on me. Like,
Yeah.
my bad.
Yeah.
And in that state, like, it takes me a few minutes to be able to get to that level of humility, because I'm still in that offensive, defensive, defended place
Mhm.
where, like, I have now, like, it's come out, my anger has come out,
Yeah.
and now it's like I have to do the work to bring it back in.
You know, I hear that story and I think back to where I was maybe 5 years ago.
Mm.
Let's call it there. And definitely 10 years ago for sure. And how many times I got into fights with my partner because of something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of taking a pause, coming from a place of humility and like, oh, I've gone wrong. I need to retract. I need to step back and, pull it back in and apologize, repair, that sort of thing. Instead, I would double down
Mm-hmm.
and be like, no, I'm right. And then I would bring in all these other things that I had resentment about, and like little things that like were bothering me, or even maybe like things that need to be brought up. But because my boundaries are not firm and solid, they haven't been brought up. I've been letting them go. And I'd be bringing all this shit into the conversation, into this like just shit soup of an argument fight. And it's just a mess, you know? And
Uh-huh.
like that's how I would communicate sometimes. Like not often, but it definitely would happen. And more I'm seeing that pattern playing out and be like, oh, back up there. Pump the
Mm-hmm.
brakes.
Mm-hmm.
And since doing quite a bit of work on myself and my wife, doing her work too, we don't get into those massive blowout fights anymore that we started to get into once we had kids. Because the energy was a little bit, there was less to go around. That's what started to happen for us.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
like learning to embody this archetype and learning how to have it reflected back to you, learning how to come from a state of humility, it's vital to meaningful, lasting, resilient relationships.
Yes. So we've talked around this piece that I want to just name, which is the delineation between the warrior in the way that we're talking about it
Mm-hmm.
and the fighter.
Yeah.
And
Which can be called the warrior in certain contexts. Like I've
right,
heard it from certain people being referred
right,
to as the warrior energy.
right. And so to me, I'm actually going to quote Isla here, because we were talking about the warrior archetype yesterday. And I was like, so what is it to you? So I had my own words that I was using around it. And it was like, my words were hella heady. And she said it in a way I was like, all right, can I quote you? Like, that's it. And it's really simple. The warrior protects the sacred.
That feels true. Yeah. And when you say that, memories and images of times when I've been doing that as of late have come up now. And there are certain boundaries that I've put in place that even my partner might cross sometimes. And she's crossing that boundary, and I have to be very firm, but I have to do it in a way that invites her to come along with me. And I can use a specific example. We have a value of using less plastic in our lives. Right? I feel that is a protection of the sacred. The environment is sacred. And there is no denying that all the plastic we're using is hugely detrimental to so much of that which is sacred in our world.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing we've committed to is not buying plastic toys, not buying new plastic items. So if we do buy something plastic, it's something used. So we're not adding more waste. And my wife started, she had a childhood where she didn't receive that many toys or gifts or things of that nature. And so there's this piece of her that wants to give that to our children. And so we've been tired because we weren't sleeping very well. And we have like all these responsibilities. And so that value of hers, I think from just sort of like that tiredness and that overwhelm kind of got cast to the wayside, which is very common and reasonable. Like I get it. It's like, oh, this value that's like our higher self is being forgotten because we're like just kind of trying to survive right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so she brought home a plastic toy, and I mentioned it to her. I was like, yeah, that kind of crosses that boundary for me. And then she did it again like a week later, maybe 2 weeks later. I don't know the exact time frame, but she did it again shortly thereafter. And I was a little firmer, and I really dug my feet in the sand with it. And she pushed, and then we ended up having a really deep conversation about it. And I gave her the space to speak out like her piece, why it was happening. I gave her the space to open up, work through it herself, with me as a reflection rather than me just like talking down to her and telling her like it is. Right. And in that, she was able to then get back on board, like, oh, what am I doing? Like, this is against what I'm doing. But when I was talking down to her about it, she then resisted, even though she agreed deep down.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was not protecting the sacred in the way that it needed to be protected. That wasn't working.
Yeah, part of what I'm hearing you talk about, if I like wrap just another layer to it.
Please.
Part of the sacred to me, and actually like a huge part of the sacred to me, is authentic experience. And so any moment where I like talk down on, or just like you're wrong, how could you do it this way?
Have that
like
righteous energy.
I'm actually not protecting the sacred in that moment, because I'm hurting like childhood wound, whatever it might be that the other person next to me is having.
Yeah.
And at that point, they have no choice but to fight back, because their sacredness is actually being threatened.
Yeah. Which then, I love that you brought that in, because it's like the sacred. I'm looking at the sacred in that place where I was coming from, where I was making that mistake of attacking. I was protecting that physical sacred. The like plastic, not using plastic. But I wasn't looking at deeper layers. My wife's spiritual sacredness, her spirit, which had been harmed as a child. And then I'm harming it in the way that I'm speaking to her. And then once I did operate in a way that was in alignment and that she could receive it, it was like she just fell right on board and was like, what am I doing?
So I want to zoom way out for a second if you're open.
I'm very open.
So when we started this conversation, and as we've been having this conversation over time beyond just this podcast, we talked about this idea of the sacred masculine warrior as an archetype. And I actually feel like I want to pull out of that word archetype a little bit, because it feels like there's a connotation of like it's confined to just one thing.
Yeah.
That can be expressed more than one way. But the way that I feel this energy is it's actually an energetic stance that can and does inhabit every other archetype that I allow it to. And it's the stance of deep responsibility.
Yeah.
With a deep reverence for what is sacred. And that requires me living in what I perceive to be a culture that has in large part forgotten what it means to hold the sacred, just period.
And value the sacred.
Yeah. I got to get really curious with what the sacred actually is.
Yeah.
And that means that I got to go beyond myself, because I don't determine what is sacred.
Yeah.
So I got to learn what is sacred.
Yeah. And that brings forth this, like, how do you learn what is sacred? And I can't determine what's sacred. You can't tell me what is sacred. No one can tell you what is sacred. It has to come from this place deep inside of you and outside of you, right? That intuition, that place that comes to you when you're quiet and you're listening. You're really listening. You're really seeing. You're really feeling. That's where you find it. At least that's for me, where I find it. And when I found that, and then I talk with other people, and they found it too, that's when I'm really like, oh, I got here on my own and you got there on your own. And yeah, okay.
Now, where can we go together? Where can we go together, right? Because that's that next layer. It's like we found something on our own. What happens when we bring it into community? What happens when we do it together? And that's has been and continues to be this question that I am so inspired to explore. Because as I explore it, I find more and more and more, and drop deeper and deeper and deeper, and become more and more a being that actually sees and witnesses the sacred as a felt experience.
Amazing. To zoom it in again, I do a practice every morning, right? A zero form practice. And I typically go out in the forest behind my house. And in that practice, I pray to the cardinal directions, to the earth and the sky. And I have various animal spirits I pray to. And one expression of the sacred that I've gotten to experience as of late is certain birds that I pray to those animal spirits, and they keep showing up in those cardinal directions that I'm praying to. So I pray to the hawk to the east, and that hawk again this morning as I go out to do my practice. There are very few hawks where I live. I live like down in a hollow, so it's like not a great hunting ground for them. But this hawk landed on a branch as I'm walking out to do my practice, and just stops, looks back to me, and then takes off. And it's like that right there. That's sacred.
The only thing that I'll add to this, for me, that is an easy place to feel and see the sacred. When I go down to the gas station and I watch people just like blurring by, no connection to one another, consuming whatever it is that they're consuming through news and everything else, it's harder to see it. And that then becomes my work.
Well said. Well said. Good invitation.
Which I fail at constantly and
daily.
Keep on coming back to.
Daily. It's a good challenge, though. Thank you for today. Thank you for this conversation. I appreciate it, brother.
If you're curious about our 9-month Initiate program, check out the link in the description.
When you're ready to begin your journey, visit elementalmovement.life